Okay guys, so we're going to go ahead and read the second chapter of our new chapter book, which is Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory by Roald Dahl. So remember, in yesterday's first chapter, we were introduced to some of our characters, which was the Bucket family. Remember, we have Charlie, our main character, who is a little boy, and then we have his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Bucket, and then his two sets of grandparents, Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine, and Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina. Okay, so now we are going to, I think, be introduced to our next main character. Remember, a character is one of the animals or people that are written about in a book, which is Willy Wonka. So we're going to learn about him today. All right, Chapter 2, Mr. Willy Wonka's Factory. In the evenings, after he had finished his supper of watery cabbage soup, Charlie always went into the room of his four grandparents to listen to their stories and then afterwards to say goodnight. Every one of these old people was over 90 years old. They were as shriveled as prunes and as bony as skeletons, and throughout the day, until Charlie made his appearance, they lay huddled in their one bed, two at either end, with nightcaps on to keep their heads warm, dozing the time away with nothing to do. But as soon as they heard the door opening and heard Charlie's voice saying, "Good evening, Grandpa Joe, and Grandma Josephine, and Grandpa George, and Grandma Georgina," then all four of them would suddenly sit up and their old wrinkled faces would light up with smiles of pleasure. And the talking would begin, for they loved this little boy. He was the only bright thing in their lives, and his evening visits were something that they looked forward to all day long. Often, Charlie's mother and father would come in as well, and stand by the door listening to the stories that the old people told, and thus, for perhaps half an hour every night, this room would become a happy place, and the whole family would forget that it was hungry and poor. One evening, when Charlie went to see his grandparents, he said to them, "Is it really true that Willy Wonka's chocolate factory is the biggest in the world?" "True?" cried all four of them at once. "Of course it's true. Good heavens, didn't you know that? It's about 50 times as big as any other chocolate factory." "And is Mr. Willy Wonka really the cleverest chocolate maker in the world?" "My dear boy," said Grandpa Joe, raising himself up a little higher on his pillow, "Mr. Willy Wonka is the most amazing, the most fantastic, the most extraordinary chocolate maker that this world has ever seen. I thought everybody knew that." "I knew he was famous, Grandpa Joe, and I knew he was very clever." "Clever?" cried the old man. "He's more than that. He's a magician with chocolate. He can make anything he wants." "Isn't that a fact, my dears?" he said to the other grandparents. The other three old people nodded their heads slowly up and down and said, "Absolutely true, just as true as it could be." And Grandpa Joe said, "You mean to say I've never told you about Mr. Willy Wonka and his factory?" "Never," answered little Charlie. "Good heavens above, I didn't know. What's the matter with me?" "Well, will you tell me about it now, Grandpa Joe?" "Please," said Charlie. "I certainly will. Sit down beside me on the bed, my dear, and listen carefully." Grandpa Joe was the oldest of the four grandparents. He was 96 and a half, and that is just about as old as anyone could ever be. Like all extremely old people, he was delicate and weak, and throughout the day he spoke very little. But in the evenings, when Charlie, his beloved grandson, was in the room, he seemed, in some marvelous way, to grow quite young again. All his tiredness fell away from him, and he became as eager and excited as a young boy. "Oh, what a man he is, this Mr. Willy Wonka!" cried Grandpa Joe. "Did you know, for example, that he has himself invented more than 200 new kinds of candy bars, each with a different center, each far sweeter and creamier and more delicious than anything the other chocolate factories could make?" "Perfectly true," cried Grandma Josephine, "and he sends them all to the four corners of the earth. Isn't that so, Grandpa Joe?" said Grandma Josephine. "It is, my dear, it is. to all the kings and presidents of the world as well. But it isn't only candy bars that he makes. Oh dear me, no. He has some really fantastic inventions up his sleeve. Mr. Willy Wonka does. Did you know that he's invented a way of making chocolate ice cream so that it stays cold for hours and hours without being in the freezer? You can even leave it lying in the sun all morning on a hot day and the ice cream won't go runny. But that's impossible, said little Charlie, staring at his grandfather. Of course it's impossible, cried Grandpa Joe. It's completely absurd. But Mr. Willy Wonka has done it indeed. Quite right, the others agreed, nodding their heads. Mr. Willy Wonka has done it. And then again, Grandpa went on, speaking very slowly now so that Charlie wouldn't miss a word. Mr. Willy Wonka can make marshmallows that taste of violets and rich caramel, that change color every 10 seconds as you suck on them, and little feathery sweets that melt away deliciously the moment that you put them between your lips. He can make chewing gum that never loses its flavor, and candy balloons that you blow up to enormous sizes before you pop them with a pin and gobble them all up. And, by a most secret method, he can make lovely bluebird's eggs with black spots on them, and when you put one of those in your mouth, it gradually gets smaller and smaller and smaller until there's suddenly nothing left except a tiny little pink sugary baby bird sitting on the tip of your tongue. Grandpa Joe paused and ran the point of his tongue slowly over his lips. It makes my mouth water just thinking about it, he said. Me too, said little Charlie. But please go on. While they were talking, Mr. and Mrs. Bucket, Charlie's mother and father, had come quietly into the room and now were both standing just inside the door listening to Grandpa Joe. Tell Charlie about that crazy Indian prince, said Grandma Josephine. He'd like to hear that one. You mean Prince Pondicherry? Said Grandpa Joe, and he began chuckling with laughter. Completely dotty he was, said Grandpa George. But he was very rich, said Grandma Georgina. What did he do? Asked Charlie eagerly. Listen, said Grandpa Joe, and I will tell you. All right, so guys, that is the end of our second chapter of Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. I hope you're enjoying our new chapter book. Come back tomorrow for chapter 3.